Welcome to our video. This is Chapter 7, Hispanic American Movements in the U.S. So on to the first section of the chapter, how and why did Mexican Americans campaign for equality before 1980?
Early years of Mexican immigration. From the mid-19th century onwards, the USA attracted many Mexican immigrants both legally and illegally. Employers such as farmers and railroad owners welcomed them to exploit them for their cheap labor, as they were usually poor and looking for work. Mexican Americans have a long history of activism and search for equality, and historic discrimination in education, housing, law enforcement, and voting pushed middle-class Mexican Americans to create civil rights and lobbyist groups such as the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, in 1929. The role of LULAC. LULAC was committed to assisting Mexicans in assimilation into U.S. society. It did not allow non-U.S. citizens to join and supported restrictions on Mexican immigration so they could properly assimilate immigrants without having an overwhelming amount of people to assist. Mexican American activism increased after 1945. LULAC achieved several local victories such as Mendez versus Westminster, which ended segregation in schooling for 5,000 Mexican Americans. There was also a big victory for Mexican American veterans as they won subsidized college educations for their service in World War II. The 1960s. Prior to the 1960s, there had been a lack of interest in civil rights and voting in the Mexican American community. It was in the 1960s that the community had an awakening. This was due to the Black Civil Rights Movement and its success, as well as a variety of other factors. A lot happened throughout the decade. There were multiple elected officials, the first one being Democrat Henry B. Gonzalez, in the picture to the right, from Texas. He was elected into the U.S. House of Representatives. There were also two large movements known as the United Farm Worker Movement and the Chicano Movement during that decade. The United Farm Worker Movement. The United Farm Worker Movement began with the establishment of the National Farm Workers Association by Cesar Chavez in 1962. In 1965, his small group joined a strike started by Filipino farm workers, which united all of the groups into the UFW against the San Joaquin Valley grape growers. In 1966, Cesar Chavez organized the nonviolent 300-mile march to Sacramento to protest their conditions. That year, with the help of the white liberals, they were able to successfully do a national boycott of the grapes, which forced the growers to sign union contracts. Local protests across the Southwest combined together against widespread discrimination to become the national campaign known as the Chicano Movement. These include the Tejano Movement in Crystal City, the Blowout Staged High School walkouts, the Reyes-Lopez Tijerina New Mexico land reclamation, and protests across Texas, Colorado, and California. These movements brought national attention to the Mexican American agenda and needs.
And now on to the second section of this chapter, how and why did Puerto Ricans campaign for equality before 1980? Okay, so to begin with some background information, in 1898, the United States acquired Puerto Rico from Spain, and by 1917, they had granted them citizenship. By 1970, 1.4 million Puerto Ricans lived on the U.S. East Coast. However, they were facing poverty, racism, unemployment, and de facto segregation. They lived together concentrated in barrios in large cities such as New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, where gangs, violence, and drugs were very common. However, they were marking progress. By 1960, only 14% of Puerto Ricans had completed high school. That number went up to 30% by 1970, and there was also a huge increase in activism. So when and why did Puerto Ricans campaign for civil rights? In the 1950s, there was an emergence of ethnic associations, trade unionism, and political groups in New York barrios. An example is a group named Aspira, which was established in 1961 in New York, whose main goal was to reduce Puerto Rican high school dropout rates. Then in the 1960s, police brutality, exclusion, and a low standard of living inspired riots in New Jersey's Puerto Rican barrios. The results were quite positive as the riots inspired more trade union involvement and the creation of new organizations such as the Young Lords Party, which is also seen in many of the pictures. Now, the aims of Puerto Rican activists and groups such as the Young Lords Party were to empower neighborhoods, to gain independence from the United States, to gain a better education, more healthcare, and increased welfare rights. Now, the groups were very successful as there was progress in education. Colleges such as City College in New York introduced new courses, and in 1972, the group Aspira won a ruling that made bilingual education possible. And now on to the third section of the chapter. To what extent did the situation of Hispanic Americans improve in the years 1970 to 2000? So beginning with the 1970s, bilingual and bicultural education programs, curriculum reforms, and Centers for Hispanic Studies demonstrated the increased influence of Hispanic Americans. Advocacy and lobbying groups were also becoming more and more effective, such as LULAC, NCLR, NALEO, and MALDEF. In 1970, Hispanic Americans marked a huge victory with the help of MALDEF activists. In the Cisneros versus Corpus Christi Independent School District case, Mexican Americans were deemed eligible for special federal protection and redress. Also, the 1972 Equal Employment Opportunity Act gave the EEOC more power to sue companies that discriminated against workers, and the OMB 1977 encouraged affirmative action programs for Spanish speakers. Now moving on to the 1980s, which are often called the Hispanic Decade because there was increased politicization of Hispanic Americans, effective Latino lobbying as seen through the amnesty provision from the Immigration Reform Control Act, and an increased representation in the government. Gerrymandering was also quite beneficial as the 1982 congressional districts were drawn so that concentrated minorities in an area had the right to elect a candidate of their choice. Moreover, by 2002, the 6 states that had the largest Latino populations, which were Arizona, California, Florida, New Mexico, New York, and Texas, they had elected 5,537 Latino officials. However, during the Reagan years, there were cuts in social programs, affirmative action began being considered reverse discrimination, and Proposition 187, which halted the progress of Hispanic American rights. And now moving on to the 1990s, were they a turning point for Hispanic Americans? Well, one of the things that was proposed in the 1990s was Proposition 187. The main goal was to deny services to undocumented immigrants except for emergency health care. However, it was deemed unconstitutional at a federal court because illegal immigrants could not be asked their status. The rejection of Proposition 187 demonstrates the efficiency of Latino lobbying. It was also very positive because it increased Latino voters after 1994. During the 1990s, labor unions were also revived in Latino areas of work. Examples include the Service Employees International Union, New York's Health and Hospital Workers, and Los Angeles Hotel Employees Union, which were all Latino immigrant-driven. Lastly, another reason why the 1990s were a good decade for Hispanic Americans was because of their increased representation, which is very well demonstrated by statistics. By 2000, Latinos were 7% of U.S. voters. By 1994, there were over 5,000 Latino officials. By 2000s, Latinos made 25% of seats in the California State Legislature's lower house. By 2004, there were 24 Latinos in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, these are only some of the examples that demonstrate their increased political representation in the United States. However, we need to focus on the reality of the situation, which is that equality had not been achieved. For example, in 2007, Latinos made only 6% of the representatives in the House and only 3% of the senators in the Senate, while they were 14% of the total U.S. population, which goes to show that proportionally they were underrepresented. And now to Section 4, had Latinos achieved equality by the early 21st century?
Racial profiling In the 1990s, Latinos felt victimized by racial profiling. In states across the nation, Latino youths were 3 to 8 times more likely to be jailed than white youths. A report by the New York State Attorney General recorded that while African Americans and Hispanic Americans constituted under 50% of the population in New York, they constituted 84% of the 175,000 stops by the NYPD officers from January 1998 to March 1990. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, neighbors or Puerto Ricans participated in large-scale demonstrations against police brutality became major targets of city/states co-optations, that is, favoring families/blocks that did not protest and had selective abuse. This made Puerto Rican activists increasingly cautious in the 1990s. Disadvantages in education. Throughout the 20th century, legal cases helped erode de jure segregation. In 2000, 52% of Latinos graduated from high school, while 86% of white Americans did. 11% of Latinos were college graduates compared to 26% who were white. Along with segregation, there were issues with school financing, education of undocumented children, and bilingual education and affirmative action. Some schools resented funding education for undocumented students and funding bilingual education. Affirmative action was implemented, and Latinos illegitimately reaped benefits meant for African Americans. Latinos were pushed back within Texas state law, and top 10% of graduates were eligible for admission to the University of Texas. Poverty and affirmative action. 30% of Latino population was in middle class, and poverty of Latinos remained twice that of the general population. In 1999, the average household income for a Latino was $29,000, while compared to a white was $43,000. Puerto Ricans remained below the rest of the U.S. Latino population in the social-economic terms, and poorly educated Latinos often gravitated towards informal economy, which included off-the-book activities. Affirmative action. Employment and education benefited minorities and helped diversify. And white backlash gained strength in the 90s, causing struggles for some Latinos. And Proposition 209 helped end some affirmative action programs, and the University of California's Latinos population started to drop.
And now to the last section of the chapter, why and with what results was Hispanic immigration a controversial issue?
The immigration debate. Proposition 187 debate. In an election campaign conducted during the 1994 economic downturn, Governor Pete Wilson argued that California spent too much money on social services such as emergency hospital care for undocumented immigrants. When the legality of Proposition 187 was tested and rejected in the courts, Wilson argued that children born to illegal aliens should not automatically qualify for citizens, as they are currently did under the 14th Amendment. The economic debate. Some Americans argued that immigrants took jobs from Americans, put excessive pressure upon public facilities such as schools and hospitals, and needed expensive bilingual educational programs that impeded their acculturation and diverted money from education from the educated of the native-born children. Law and order debate. Many white Americans believe immigrants from ethnic minorities elevated the crime rate. During the 20th century, the Mexican-American population became increasingly urbanized, which generated social problems. For example, the already poor conditions in Los Angeles' Westlake area were aggravated by waves of Mexican and Central American immigration in the 1980s. Westlake became famous for its high crime rates and substantially gang activity. The assimilation debate. From the 1980s, there were frequent accusations that immigrants failed to assimilate. Critics claimed that Latino immigrants were particularly slow to acculturate because they frequently returned to their homelands and congregated together in the same neighborhood.
And this is the end. Thanks for watching.